Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in the Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don Preston, and look who's with us this evening over here.
My name is William Bell.
There you go. Yeah, it's great to have you back, William. Daniel Rogers could not be with me this afternoon. He sent me an email early this morning and said, "Hey, sorry I couldn't be there." Well, last week I couldn't be on the program. I woke up that morning, and the minute I sat up on the edge of the bed, it's like, uh-oh, something is not good. But I managed to get up and go around and everything. And I laid down early that afternoon to take a little bit of a nap. I was sharing with William that for some reason or other, I've been waking up about 2:15, 2:20 of a morning every morning, and I can't go back to sleep. So I just go ahead and come to the office. It was, I think it was 2:20 when I woke up this morning and came on over to the office. But anyway, when I laid down to take the nap, I woke up and boy, I mean, the sky fell on me. And for about the next 48 hours, I felt like a truck ran over me. And so, anyway, I couldn't be here last week. Daniel can't be here this evening. So Daniel, when he emailed me, I said, "Well, that's fine. I'll contact William, see if he can step in, because it has been a good little while, and it's always great to have you back on the show, William."
Well, it's a pleasure to be back. It's always good to be with you, and always looking forward to our studies together. I hope Daniel is fine, and but it's a pleasure to be with you, and looking forward to it tonight.
You bet. First of all, why don't you share with us how things are going with your ministry in Ghana? You obviously got a lot going on there. Just give us a thumbnail sketch, an overview of how things are going.
Well, at the current time, we are working with Brother Solomon over there to help him get his building up. He's working out of a small school room at the time, and it's kind of off from the road, and they have some land that they purchased, which is right on the main road that goes from Cape Coast to Jukwa, and it's in a town called Bribadzi, I believe, and that we've helped them lay the foundation for it. So they've got the foundation laid, and now we're going to the next stage where we start doing the walls. And Solomon is consistently, bringing people into the church, so that's good. And we're working with another guy about maybe 3 or 4 hours away. It's about 2 hours in each direction. 2 hours to Solomon's place in Cape Coast, and then 2 hours to this guy in the Volta region. And so we're working with him. We taught in both areas. We have several people interested. He's trying to get me to come back already. Because there were several people who were interested, and they want to set up a class and have something going on regularly. So they're intending for me to come and spend a little bit more time with them so that they can get these things going. But it's going pretty good at this point. I'm really pleased with that. And then we have another young man in. You've probably heard him, if you've heard him hang out with Solomon. His name is Raymond. He is attending the Kwame Nkrumah University. And so we've been helping him with that. He's young. I think he told me he just turned 24 or 25. He's in his last year of school. And, I was fortunate enough Leora and I were fortunate enough to help him go through school. But he was working with the congregation, doing extremely well with the congregation, but they saw fit, because of his eschatological views, to say goodbye to him. And they couldn't answer, but he was very good at their evangelism program and bringing a lot of people to the church. So he's now about to graduate sometime in October or November, somewhere around that time. And so he's going to have, much more time besides, trying to make a living from all the schooling he's done. He's going to be in agriculture, but he is looking forward to being involved with the church even more. But he gets into debates and discussions all the time. And so we are really excited about him. As a matter of fact, I spoke to him on yesterday, had a chance to say hello to his mom. It's my first time meeting her, because he's getting ready to go back to school after the break. and he happened to be at home at that time, so he introduced me to her, and Leora and I talked to her. But yeah, that's what's going on, and so we're looking forward to some things really. Once we get the building up at Solomon's, I think some things are really going to take off there, and because he's got a pretty good solid relationship with the people there. And by the way, Solomon was named I think the #1 junior farmer or something like that. He won the contest for junior farmer in his area. So he's pretty diligent, pretty consistent, and yet he stays pretty consistent with teaching covenant eschatology along the way. And the broadcast that we did drew some attention. He said that he's got this guy, I think I might have mentioned this to you before, but he's got this guy in the Church of Christ, by the way, who watches him, and as soon as they come on, they basically say, okay, here comes the heretic or something of that nature, and they all get together and just try to team up against him. But when I was on with him, the time that I was there, we got back some positive questions from them and some positive feedback. So he said the guy wants to sit down with me and talk with me. So looking forward to that happening at some point in time.
Absolutely.
That's pretty much it.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And I do know about Raymond. He and I have corresponded some together, and he has certainly seemed like an awfully sharp young guy. I didn't know a lot of details about him, just some of the theological questions that he asked and what have you. So it's good to know a little bit more information about that. I did not know of his relationship with Solomon, so that's great to know.
Yeah, that's how I came to know him, was through Solomon. And Solomon has a WhatsApp group where he teaches eschatology, and Raymond has been a part of that for some years. I mean, it's been going on, and they're pretty diligent about it as well. They brought a lot of people in, and he's doing some Zoom meetings now, I think, in the evening, because he's invited me to join him on a couple of those. I was only able to do some when I was there, and I think I might have done 1 or 2 here, but he's really trying to get the word out.
That's awesome. All right. Well, great to hear that news. Great to hear the feedback there. Daniel and I have been talking about the Messianic Temple, and had you on a couple of months ago, and we continued that discussion. And a couple of weeks ago, I picked the discussion up in 2 Corinthians into the latter part of chapter 4 and into chapter 5. And I know that you've done extensive study on 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and the Messianic Temple motif there, and how the great majority of commentators take 2 Corinthians chapter 5 as talking about of seeing Paul talking about individual bodies. That if the earthly house of this tabernacle, that's our physical body, is destroyed, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So that's us. When we die, we go to heaven, which flies in the face of an awful lot of traditional eschatological views, by the way.
Yes.
Folks in the churches of Christ in which William and I were raised, the view is that when a faithful Christian dies, they absolutely do not go to heaven. They can't go to heaven. They got to wait until they got to wait until the end of time and the judgment. They got to wait in paradise, Abraham's bosom, until the end of time. At the end of time, then they get to come back to earth. They get their physical body. It's transformed. Then they get to go to heaven. That is
go ahead. Go ahehave. I was going to say, before all that happens, they preach them in heaven at the funeral.
Oh yeah. You and I both have talked about this an awful lot. We have a 2-tiered eschatology in the amillennial world that if they're not talking about actual eschatology, then this faithful brother, this faithful sister, when they died, they're in the arms of the Lord today, and heaven just as sure as we're standing here. Very, very quick anecdote. The mother of a very, very good friend of mine passed away several years ago, and very, very faithful Christian lady, wonderful, wonderful Christian lady. And the preacher that was doing the sermon, I knew of him, he knew of me. And so he's standing up there talking about what a wonderful Christian woman she was. And he said, I want to tell you with full assurance, this sister so-and-so said she is in heaven today as surely as we're standing here. And I just kind of, got a grin at the corner of my mouth. And he said, now, we all know that she's not truly in heaven, that she's in Hades, waiting for the resurrection for this body to come out of this ground. I mean, this is 2 seconds after he had said she's in heaven as surely as we are here today. But he looked at me, he saw that little grin on my face, like, gotcha. I mean, it was so blatant. And I don't know if anybody else caught it except her son, who is super good friend of mine and a preterist. He caught it for sure. He kind of glanced over at me, when all this was going down, like, oh boy, whatever. So anyway, let's take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4 before we get directly into chapter 5.
Okay.
As the lead into it, because here Paul is talking about the sufferings that they were experiencing at that time, the persecution that the church was experiencing at that time. And he kind of sets the stage for chapter 5, the groanings of that persecution. But he says something really, really fascinating insofar as the hope that he was talking about. We do not look at the things that are seen, but that are unseen. The things that are seen are temporal or temporary. The things that are unseen are eternal. And then he talks about that house that is laid up in heaven, eternal in the heavens. So you have this direct corollary between that which is in the heaven, that which at the time that they were groaning, waiting for the revelation of that, and then he discusses that. Why don't you comment there on 2 Corinthians 4:16 and following as a lead in to chapter 5?
Yeah, well, with me just kind of starting in, I have chapter 3 in the back of my mind, which starts with that discussion of the ministration of death and versus the ministration of righteousness, meaning the difference between the old and the new covenant. So that's the background of chapters 3, 4, and 5, and even moving into chapter 6. And so when we're looking in chapter 4, somehow people think that Paul has transitioned from his overall thesis in the chapter, from the overall motif of dealing with these two covenantal modes of existence, but he's not. He's remaining consistent with that all the way through. And so when we get to verse 16, and he says, therefore, we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing. The outward man would be that ministration of death that he had talked about in chapter 3, where he says it was their hope that the glory that would excel would overcome that which was remaining, or rather, which I'm saying it backwards. Let me read the verse and I can get it better. He says, for if what is passing away was glorious. Well, that's that ministration of the old covenant. That's the outward man that he speaks about. It's not a Greek Platonic flesh versus spirit concept. It is the old covenant, which was the mode of the flesh in terms of the covenantal body versus the mode of the spirit. And Paul even uses spirit and flesh in the context. But he says, if what is passing away was glorious, what remains is much more glorious. And therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech. Now, when he gets down to verse 18 of chapter 3, he says that we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the Lord, the glory of the Lord, are being transformed. So there's that present tense term there that's indicating this was ongoing at that time. They were currently being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. So that glory, again, goes back to verses 10 and 11, referring to that old covenant glory. So he has not digressed from that motif of dealing with the glory versus the more glory in chapter 4 all the way down to the end. And that's why it makes the transition from 16 through 18, that much more powerful. And thus the outward man that was perishing was the old covenant man. The inward man is the new covenant man, which he says was being renewed day by day. And what's interesting there, if the new man was our inner man, as they call it, as they say when they're making this dichotomy between the body and the flesh, then you have one dying, you have the body dying, but the inward man is being renewed day by day, but that's considered to be resurrection. So if that's resurrection, where's the resurrection of the body involved in that? When it's the inward man that's being raised, and Paul said that's the hope. So that just would make sense. Then you'd have the hope of the inner man, but not with the one that's perishing. So that's one thing to look at. And then, as you were saying a moment ago, our light affliction. Well, those are the eschatological sufferings that Paul mentioned in Romans 8, verse 18, et cetera, and that we see throughout the scriptures in Thessalonians. He says, which is but for a moment, and is working for us this far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Well, that's the far more glory that he talked about in chapter 3. And then coming into that statement, while we do not look at the things which are seen. Well, in their cultus, what was seen? It was the priesthood, it was the sacrifices, it was the temple, it was all of those things that they could put their hands on and say, you see, this is what makes our faith more real than what you are dealing with that you can't see, you can't touch, etc. And that's just the very opposite of the way the Bible reveals it. And so we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. And that's also the fact that they were unrealized. That's another aspect of that. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And verse 1 of chapter 5 actually explains what he's just said in that context. And he goes into these terms. I'm going to stop there because I don't know how far you want to go into chapter 5 just yet. So I'll just pause at that moment until we discuss it a little further.
Well, yeah, that's fine. What strikes me about this is that, as you pointed out there, and I'll just try to add a few additional thoughts in my own words here. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, we have a process of something passing away and something coming in, something of glory versus something of greater glory. Those are the exact, as you were pointing out, I'm just giving my different words for it. Those are the exact same motifs of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 16 and following. Therefore, we do not lose heart. For though our outward man perish, though our inner man is renewed day by day. Well, you have a perishing and a renewal. You have a perishing in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. The old law was perishing. It was passing away. Versus that which could never be moved, and that's the new covenant. That was that hidden new covenant reality that was waiting to be revealed. We find this, and you and I have discussed this many times down through the years. I know Max King discussed it a lot from different times, and scholars recognize this. In the New Testament, there is the concept of the hiddenness of the children of God. That they were the children of God. They were waiting to be manifested. Romans chapter 8 is a prime example of it. Paul said, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed. What was that glory that was about to be revealed? Sonship. They were already sons of God, just like 1 John chapter 3 says. Now, brethren, we are sons of God, but it does not yet appear what we shall be like. Colossians chapter 3. If then you died with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sits at the right hand of God. For if you died, your life is hidden with Christ. But when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall we also appear with him in glory. So you have this constant theme throughout the New Testament of a reality that was known to those in the reality, but that had not yet been manifested to the world. There was a huge controversy going on in the first century about who are the sons of God. The Jews
Go ahead.
Jews, yeah, go ahead. Well, let me
No,
finish up
yeah,
here.
finish up your point.
The Jews had been saying, rightly so, they were the sons of God. 1,500 years of testimony. And now all of a sudden, here these Christians, followers of this Nazarene, are saying, guess what? If you don't follow Christ, you are not of the chosen seed. You are not an Israelite. You are not a Jew. Just like Peter said in Acts chapter 3, citing Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 18, where Moses himself said, God will raise up a prophet like unto me. To him you shall give heed, and it shall come to pass that anyone who will not give heed to his voice shall be utterly cut off out from among the people. So here's Peter speaking to, quote, good, faithful Jews, saying, guess what, folks? You're not really of the seed of Abraham if you're not following Jesus. Here's this controversy. Who are the children of God? This is part of what's been playing out here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and 4 and 5, as Paul sets forth. The old covenant, which the Jews were holding on to, adamantly, belligerently, violently, and the new covenant that was being revealed at the time, manifesting itself in the lives of the followers of Christ, and yet this struggle, this power struggle between the two camps, between the two seeds, as Paul was called it in Galatians chapter 4. There's the seed of the flesh, there's the seed of the promise. And what's the fate of the seed of the flesh? Cast out the bondwoman and her son. Shall not be heirs of the children of the promise. So again, this is all taking place. So you have the passing away and the establishment. You have the outward man perishing, the inner man being renewed day by day. Pardon me, going into chapter 5, if this earthly house of this tabernacle is dissolved, we have a house, a greater house, a heavenly house, a glorious house. Same motifs, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. So go ahead.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, those were all powerful concepts that you just talked about. You were hitting all the cylinders in terms of, the sons of the flesh versus the sons of the spirit. You have Romans 8 and verse 19 that talks about the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. So there's that idea. And that's one of the things that confuses so many people about studying the resurrection, because they think it's a raising of something that you already see or can see from the ground at some time in the future, whereas this was a process that had begun way back then in the first century and was being consummated, whereas God had to have some external event that would manifest that, because that's the way you manifest spiritual things. It's like Romans chapter 1, where he talks about clearly the Godhead is manifested by the things which are seen, so that his invisible nature is recognized. We can't see him with our eyes, but he leaves evidences in the world whereby we can determine it. And even in the prophetic scene, God would always tell them, when I do this thing, then shall you know that I am the Lord. And that's a concept that a lot of people miss. Going back to these sons of God in John 1, verses 11 or 12 and 13, when he says, as many as received him, to them he gave the authority to become the sons of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. I remember when I wrote that book, on the first little book that I wrote, which was a transcribed sermon for the most part, but it was dealing with that. Who are the true sons of God? And that's the backdrop of the new covenant, this contesting over who is the son of God. Now, here's another point I wanted to mention, going back to what we were saying before on the outward man perishing, but the inward man being renewed day by day. If that's the case, then it's only half of the church that's perishing, Don. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the earlier verses in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul said that death is working in us, but life in you. So you got half of the folk in the church. I'm using half, not to say that,
Yeah.
this is a 50-50 split, but you get the idea. You got one part of the church where their bodies are dying, according to these physical futurist paradigm folks, that it's, if that's the case, then only half of the church body is dying. And the other half of the church, they're living and being raised. So what does that do for Paul when he talks about this outward man perishing, etc.? We have to understand that these are covenantal terms. They won't work with a physical situation, because everybody, as far as physical death is concerned, will experience that. And even in terms of the redemption we have in Christ and the putting away of sin, we still experience physical death. So that concept just doesn't work in dealing with this chapter.
That's exactly right. And we can go on into chapter 5 now. As I pointed out, the huge majority of commentators, they come to chapter 5, and they've, again, going back to chapter 4:16, they cherry pick these verses out from the entire covenantal context. And I've said this, I've written on this in several of my books, I've mentioned it. We have to understand that Ezekiel 37, along with Ezekiel 16, obviously, serve as the prophetic backdrop, the prophetic source for 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through into chapter 7, verse 1. Every single constituent element, ladies and gentlemen, every single one that is found in Ezekiel 37 and Ezekiel 16 is found in 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through 6, going into chapter 7, verse 1 through first couple of verses there. And yet the amazing thing about it is, as I read the commentaries, I see them saying, well, obviously Ezekiel 37 is the background. And they leave it at that. They do not exegetically develop the constituent points and how, okay, here's Ezekiel 37, resurrection. Oh, guess what? Here's 2 Corinthians 3, ministration of death versus ministration of life, transformation from death to life. They ignore this. And they ignore the fact, if our outward man is perishing, the inward man is being renewed day by day. They ignore that. Coming to chapter 5, all of a sudden, boy, yeah, Paul's talking about the hope of physical resurrection. Well, if Ezekiel 37 is in fact the background and the fountain for 2 Corinthians, let's just say 2 Corinthians 5 to make it easy, then where do you get the concept of physical resurrection in Ezekiel 37? Folks, it ain't there. What you have in Ezekiel 37 is Ezekiel's vision of the valley of dry bones. And the angel asked him, son of man, what is this? And he says, I don't know. And he says, well, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They are in captivity. Well, I'm pretty sure the angel wasn't saying these bones represent all of the dead bodies scattered throughout Assyria and scattered throughout Babylonia. I'm pretty sure that's not the point. But the Spirit of the Lord blows upon them. Those bones stand up and they live. What is this? Son of man, what is this? Well, you know. And the Spirit responds, the angel responds, I will put my Spirit in you, the whole house of Israel, and I will raise you up out of your graves. Look, most of the ancient rabbis, and even most modern scholars, even the ancient scholars for that matter, Christian scholars, understood this is a promise of the restoration of Israel under the Messiah. Had nothing to do with but dead bones in the ground. Now, my point in all of that is to say, okay, if the death, burial, and resurrection, to use those terms, in Ezekiel 37 had nothing to do with biologically dead human beings, and Paul's discourse and commentary in 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through 5 is based on Ezekiel 37, where do we get the idea of physical resurrection? in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Where does he shift from the corporate body of Israel being in the grave, being dead under the law, under the ministration of death, to the individual bodies in the grave? So I'll let you pick it up from there and make what comments you want to.
Okay. When you look at Ezekiel 37 and you compare it with 2 Corinthians 5, the very same elements that you find in Ezekiel 37 are in 2 Corinthians 5. You just mentioned the whole house of Israel. Well, look at the term that you have in 2 Corinthians 5. If this earthly house, this tent, were destroyed, we have a building of God. You also have a body. And this body has to be a mortal body because it's subject to death. He's just talked about the dry bones, right? Mm-hmm. And the flesh, etc. So he's seeing them as dead, but that's considered mortal. Now, most people think that mortality can only refer to something that's physical, and that's not biblical at all. Romans 8 will knock that out of the water very, very quickly. Then you also see, and when speaking of the house of God, you're talking about the temple or the tabernacle. So that's the same concept. You have the spirit that was going to be the means by which they were raised, because God says that he was doing that through his spirit. And of course, if that is a metaphoric expression in terms of their being dead and in the graves, that's the same concepts that's being demonstrated in chapter 5. Now, one other thing that I like to do, and even though we haven't quite gotten there yet, maybe I should hold back on this just a moment because I don't know how far we're going to get, but I also like to put Ezekiel 16 with this
Absolutely.
chapter as well. So I'll wait on that and just kind of see where you're going. But I wanted to point that out. And this is the reason, is because if a person would sit down and take those terms like body, house, temple, what are some of the other names? Kingdom,
yeah,
mortality, etc., and go through the Old Testament and look at them relative to what was being promised in the New Covenant, you would have all those concepts. Even a text, for example, like 1 Timothy 3:15. But if I'm long delayed, that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. And I'll say this last thing. Another thing that you could do or should do is go back to 1 Corinthians 15, because 2 Corinthians 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 and other passages in 1 Corinthians are dealing with the same concept. In 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 9, Paul tells them, you are God's building. All right, so there's the building. And he's certainly not talking about the earthly one in that particular point. He says they were God's field. They were God's land. And that's a good point for the dispensationalists to pick up on as well. So he's giving you all these concepts. And later on in the chapter, he talks about laying the foundation of that temple and that house, and Christ being the foundation. And also, you are the temple of the living God, etc. So all of that's in the chapter if people will take the time to just go through and look at these concepts rather than bringing their baggage and traditions into the text and assuming that it's dealing with the physical body.
Good points. Good points. Okay, well, let's look pretty closely, at least to begin to, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. Mm-hmm. We know that if the earthly house of this tabernacle, well, we have oikos, house, tabernacle, skene, which is the tabernacle, word for tabernacle in the Septuagint in the Old Testament. But William, one of the things that struck me years ago, and I remember calling you about this and getting your thoughts on it. A little bit of backstory before I call attention to it. The traditional view of eschatology and resurrection is, okay, the human body, it dies and it decays and it goes into the dust. Okay. But it is reconstituted at the end of time, reformulated, restored, and given immortality. And when you made the comment about Romans chapter 8 and the meaning of mortal, I just I couldn't I could not help but just chuckle. Just recently on YouTube, I was having a conversation with a fellow. Now I'll give him this: he's far better read than most people that attack me. I'll use that term, attack, and that because that's what it is. Uh, so he's very well read, far and above and away from most people, right? So he attacked me on Romans chapter 8. He said the mortal body is the human physical body. I said, well, I think you've got a problem here. So the mortal body is the body of flesh. Well, he agreed with that. And I said, well, you've got a real problem because Paul says you are not in the flesh. And those who are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God. Now, all of a sudden, I start getting this word salad in response from him. Well, I still take the position that mortal has to refer to the biological human body, the material human body, I think was the term that he used. And I kept pointing out, you can't say that, or else you've got to redefine flesh and redefine mortal. If you're going to define mortal as a human body, then what is the body of flesh? Well, then he finally talked about, well, flesh is living after a certain way of life. And I go, oh, hello, thank you very much. And it was a real interesting conversation. And finally, he decided that he wanted to talk about something else, claiming he had established his point, when in reality, he completely abdicated the point. I just simply started going through Romans chapter 7. I could have gone back to chapter 5, of course, when Paul said, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? He actually made the comment that Paul wanted to be free from the human existence. And I'm going, oh my goodness gracious. What an incredible point. Well, Paul said he was already not in the flesh. So he must have been free from that body of sin, a body of sin and flesh. So that's kind of the way that conversation went. But that's the way most people look at Romans chapter 8 and thus 2 Corinthians chapter 5. But all of that background leads me to some years ago, I was looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in the Greek. And when Paul says that if the earthly house of this tabernacle be dissolved, well, again, the traditional view is, okay, yeah, the body might dissolve in the grave, but it's going to be restored. There's something about it, though, that that's not found in 2 Corinthians 5. The word dissolved is from the Greek word kataluthe, and it means destroyed. It means dissolved. Interestingly enough, and it's not used, it's a word that's not used hundreds of times in the New Testament, but it is used in some very significant passages. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 2, when the disciples are showing Jesus the magnificent stones of the temple, he says, do you not see all of these things? The time is coming in which not one stone shall be left on top of another that shall not be thrown down. That's kataluthe. And that's the way kataluthe is used. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul says, if the earthly house of this tabernacle, ostensibly the human body, if it is destroyed, if it is dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, in the heavens. Well, in order to make that work, you have to go through this entire mechanization and verbal gymnastics. And you've got to say, well, yeah, there's a body in heaven, and our body is still in the dirt, dissolved. But at the end of time, this other body comes down and is superimposed. I don't know if it's zapped into the dust. I don't know how it works, but it just doesn't work. Paul has the earthly house, the house made with hands, dissolving, being destroyed. He was anticipating another house, which was in the heavens, waiting to be revealed, not waiting to be put on top of the dissolved body, per se, but to be revealed. That word kataluthe seems to me to be a tremendous problem for the traditional view of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Even when you break down the word kata, meaning down, it's like, and then you got, I think the word luo, to loose, to loose down. It's the idea of sort of disassembling something, taking it loose from the stakes, like when you have a tent or the tabernacle and they had to disassemble it. So that's the idea of what he's saying there. And then when you think about that whole thing, if we're dealing with the tabernacle from that perspective, what benefit would there be for a physical tabernacle in heaven per se? And so that becomes, the same reasoning to talk about as far as the body is concerned, because as you were saying, this is something that is being rendered null and void. This is something that is no longer of use. It's the same glory that was being surpassed in chapter 3. And so this loosing or tearing down or disassembling of the old for the building of the new, and they come from two different points, two different perspectives. One is heavenly, the other is of the earth. One is made by men's hands, one is not. And so that's very important that people recognize that it's not a raising up of that earthly one. It's a disassembling of it, a rendering where it's no longer required, needed, and effective. And that's the point.
That's exactly right. And to make a point that, to reiterate a point we made earlier, this kataluthe is parallel to what he said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Our outward man is perishing.
Mm-hmm.
Very same concept. And when you try to impose the concept of the biological body onto this text, it simply does not work. And one of the key terms that is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands. And folks, I want to tell you, this terminology, not made with hands, is an incredibly significant motif, both in the Old Testament and in the New. In the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, which of course is the Greek translation of the Masoretic text, the Old Testament, Hebrew Old Testament, made with hands, according to Timothy Gray in a commentary on Temple in the book of Mark. Great book. Highly recommend the book. Excellent scholar. Timothy Gray points out made with hands is used 14 times in the Septuagint, and it invariably refers to idolatry. Now, that's really significant. In the New Testament, we find passages, for instance, when Jesus said on one occasion in the book of Mark, destroy this house made with hands, and I will raise up another house not made with hands. Well, what was he talking about there? Well, he was talking about the house made with hands being the Jerusalem temple, the Herodian temple. It was known as a house made with hands. Now, to any good rabbinic student, the use of that term, made with hands, was going to be rather shocking, given the Septuagint use of the term always being associated with idolatry. Timothy Gray makes the observation that when Jesus used the terminology of made with hands versus not made with hands, he was kind of tacitly but very powerfully identifying the temple at Jerusalem as a house of idolatry. That had to hit awfully hard, to any of the first century Jews who heard or who read that usage by the New Testament writers. And so when we come to the New Testament and we see this constant imagery and this constant language of not made with hands, and we see that it's used in constant contrast to the old covenant temple, boy, this is some really powerful stuff. And we bring it into the text of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul's talking about temple, tabernacle made with hands, tabernacle not made with hands. Well, where's the consistent use of that terminology throughout both Old Testament and New is not a contrast between a biological human body versus a spiritual incorporeal body, but rather Old Covenant temple versus New Covenant temple. So go ahead and make your comments there.
Yeah, think about the first time that I recognized the use of not made with hands. Daniel chapter 2,
yes,
verse 34. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet, etc. Well, that stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands represents Christ and the kingdom. And so if we're talking about the kingdom of God that God was going to set up in the last days, when we see that phrase in 2 Corinthians 5, and not just in that text alone, because you have it contrasted several times in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, where it talks about the house that Solomon wanted to build, and God says the Most High does not dwell in temples made with men's hands, etc. So you have it referring to the temple, but what does that tell you concerning resurrection? It's one of the terms that I always say, and I don't know if you've ever heard it yet, but I'm still waiting to hear someone say that the kingdom is the resurrection body. Because if you study 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 50, or the entire chapter, and look at what Paul contrasts with the natural body versus the spiritual body, the kingdom of God lines up in that text, which parallels it right back to 2 Corinthians 5, because it's that which was not made with hands, taking us back to Daniel 2, which is the kingdom. And that's telling you what the nature of the body is in 2 Corinthians 5. It's also telling you that that's the temple, and it's telling you that this is what was not made with hands. He's not talking about the physical body. He's dealing with two temples. The kingdom is the temple. The kingdom is the body. And that's the body that's being referred to in that text. And as you were saying, this was a process that was ongoing. It was a transitioning out of one and a transitioning into the other, all going on at the same time. So it wasn't where, you are in this body and then you die and then you wait for who knows how many thousands of years and then you're raised up. No, this was a process that was already underway and was ongoing because, as he was saying in verse 16, as you mentioned just a moment ago, while the outward man was perishing, the inward man was being renewed day by day. So we have to pick up on that, and that just won't work with the stance on a physical body.
Yeah. And again, that goes back to this threefold reference of Paul of 2 Corinthians 3, from the ministry of death to the ministry of life, then ongoing, as you're pointed out right there. Again, 2 Corinthians 4:16, if the earthly house of this, or if the outward man is, though the outward man is perishing, get it right in a minute, present active, it was already ongoing. Here is Paul saying the inner man is being renewed day by day, which it seems to me to raise some really interesting points, William. If the spirit is eternal and immortal, how is it renewed day by day?
In terms of
what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, outward man is perishing. Well, is Paul talking about, we're growing old, and I'm noticing an awful lot of snow on the mountaintop there, William.
Of course.
So if that's what Paul has in mind, the outward man is perishing, growing old and growing gray and et cetera, what does he mean by the inner man being renewed day
Well,
by day.
yeah. Well, one thing he couldn't be indicating from that this is from a like a body spirit paradigm. I don't think he could be indicating that that is the meaning of giving it life, because if it's eternal from the beginning in terms of man's spirit, then why is the need to do that if it's already eternal?
That's my point.
Yes.
So how could you have an eternal, immortal, incorruptible spirit being renewed day by day? There is no renewal of an eternal spirit. I fail to see how you could renew an immortal, incorruptible spirit. How does that happen? How does that work? And yet, the only things that Paul has been talking about being made new is new covenant, ministry of death, ministry of life, passing from death to life, old tabernacle, new tabernacle, heavenly tabernacle versus earthly tabernacle. Those are the only passing away things versus eternal things that Paul's discussing in the entire context. And part of this gets back, boy, this is something we've discussed many, many times. The failure of modern Bible students to think in collective terms, to think in corporate terms. And Tom Holland, in his Contours of Pauline Theology, does a great job. There may be a few places that he may have overstepped his paradigm a little bit, but overall, the book is just fantastic in pointing out that Paul, in his theological development, Paul, in his discussion of resurrection, thinks in corporate terms. That doesn't exclude the individual from it. As you and I were discussing an email the other day, the individual participates in the corporate. You don't have corporate without individual participation. Those individuals make up the corporate. But from the perspective of the Hebraic writers, the Hebrew writers, and I'm not talking about the Hebrew book of Hebrews, I'm talking about the Hebrew writers. Their perspective was almost invariably focused upon the corporate body, and then how individuals participate in the blessings of that corporate reality.
Right.
So what has happened is that biblical scholars approach 2 Corinthians 4 and 5 from the perspective strictly of the individual human being, instead of viewing Paul continuing his discussion of Ezekiel 37. And Ezekiel 37 is absolutely not focused on individuals. It is about Israel raised from the graves. Pardon me. It is Israel given the new covenant. It is Israel, the corporate body, serving under David the king. It is Israel that is given the new tabernacle. And so everything in Ezekiel 37 is corporate. So it's a hermeneutical shift on the part of biblical commentators to come to 2 Corinthians 3 through 5, through 6, where Paul is very clearly drawing on and commenting on Ezekiel 37. And all of a sudden they change Ezekiel's corporate emphasis, and they have Paul focused on the individual. I just don't see that shift. And I've quoted John Levinson before. John Levinson, when he is discussing the resurrection in Ezekiel 37, he says, virtually all of the ancient rabbis acknowledged that the resurrection of Ezekiel 37 was initially viewed as a corporate resurrection and restoration of Israel. But that was later changed. He never tells us who changed it, doesn't tell us when it was changed, doesn't tell us why it was changed. He just simply says a change took place between the realization that Ezekiel 37 is corporate resurrection, but now it's been changed.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were speaking, in terms of, where the change comes from. I think, that goes back to this Gnostic concept and this Platonic concept. They always want to accuse us of being Gnostics, or, of Gnosticism, and they're the ones that want to get rid of the body. They think it's evil, they think it's sinful, etc., not really understanding what's going on. But I was thinking about some work that you and um, John Anderson did years ago from Ephesians chapter 2, which also has Ezekiel 37 as a background for it. And when you look at that, you have the same concepts and motifs in Ephesians chapter 2 that you have in 2 Corinthians 5, because you're talking about the two covenants. You're dealing with the wall of separation, which is temple concept and temple typology. Even the text that talks about having access to God, that's access into his presence, etc. And then what do you have in the end? The very terms that are used in 2 Corinthians 5, talking about the building of God, the habitation or the temple, etc. But no one looks at this chapter done and says we're dealing with the physical body. they don't do it. But right. It comes out of the same background text as 2 Corinthians 5. And it speaks of a body. It speaks of the spirit. It speaks of the temple. It talks about the transition from the one to the other. And very clearly is a commentary on both Ezekiel 37 and 2 Corinthians chapter 5.
Well, those are great thoughts. And yeah, I remember having those discussions with John Anderson on his program, The Voice of Reason. We had a great time discussing all of that. The interplay, and it shouldn't surprise us, folks, but the interplay between so many of Paul's epistles with one another, the intertextuality, as it's called among the scholars. And it's amazing how some Bible students they'll latch onto this text over here and try to discern it and try to interpret it in total isolation from everything else that Paul had to say in the entire orbit of his epistles. And that's just not the way. We have to have a holistic approach to the scriptures in trying to be what I call atomistic. And that is, oh, look, I found this one term, this word, this phrase. I found this one verse over here in the Bible that seems to fit my paradigm. So I'm going to forget anything and everything. It's kind of like in my discussion with Anthony Aquino, my formal debate with Anthony Aquino on the internet. He said, I don't want to go anywhere else but Revelation chapter 20. And he had said that in another debate that he had with Stacey Tuberville. I'm not going to go anywhere except Revelation chapter 20. Revelation 20 is the only text I'm willing to look at. Well, sorry, that may be all that you want to talk about, but that's not all that the Bible talks about on the subject. And so also in my debate with that Mark Smith guy, a former Church of Christ minister, now turned atheist, when I brought up Paul's use of the Old Testament, he said, I'm not interested in what the Old Testament says. It's unimportant. Doesn't have anything to do with the subject we're talking about. Really? Well, he just as I like to say, he gave away the farm, the dog, the cat, the horse, the cow, the sheep, the goats, the gerbils, the goldfish. He gave it all away. I mean, now, we both understand where he's coming from, right? He was raised in that Church of Christ background, extremely conservative. You don't need the Old Testament. Old Testament was nailed to the cross, totally irrelevant. So we know where he's coming from, but we also know it's totally false. And that view that God was through with Israel at the cross, that view that God was through with the Old Covenant. And this is why it's important to see Paul in 2 Corinthians 3-6 is giving his inspired commentary on Ezekiel 37 as well as Ezekiel 16. Now, William, I don't know if you want to come back next week and let's explore Ezekiel 16 and the rest of what Paul has to say here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm sure that will please Daniel, give him a little continual break. So if you're willing to do that, then we'll have you back next week.
All right. I'll look forward to it.
All right. Sounds really great. Well, with that said, folks, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on Two Guys in the Bible, a voice you can trust. And then with that, William, great to have you back. Great to be with you. Enjoyed the program. And I'll say good night. God bless.
All right. Good night.